Halloween night is always one of those times when anything can happen. It's part of the fun. You see kids running around in costumes, laughing as they collect candy, and sometimes older teens like us trying to sneak a little mischief into the night. But what happened to me last Halloween was something that I can't shake off. It wasn't just some spooky Halloween scare, it was something far worse. It started pretty normal. My friends and I weren't into trick-or-treating anymore, so we had other plans: hit up a few houses for candy, hang out, and maybe go to a Halloween party. I was dressed as Jason Voorhees, with the machete, fake blood, the whole deal, while my two friends, Chris and Ethan, were going as Ghostface and a werewolf. Typical last-minute costumes, but we didn't care. It was all about having a good time. We were about halfway through our night when we split up. Chris and Ethan wanted to go check out this haunted house attraction at the edge of town, but I wasn't really feeling it. The whole jump scare thing isn't my idea of fun, so I told them I'd catch up later. We agreed to meet back at the park after an hour or so. It was around 10 p.m., and most of the trick-or-treaters were starting to head home. The streets were clearing out, and the excitement of the night was dying down. I was walking alone, taking the long way around the neighborhood, when I heard someone calling out behind me. "Hey, kid." I turned around and saw a man in a police uniform. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he was just checking to make sure everyone was following the rules, keeping an eye on things. But as he got closer, something felt off. He didn't look like the other cops I'd seen around town. His uniform looked kind of old, worn out, like it hadn't been replaced in years, and there was no police car nearby, just him, walking alone on the sidewalk. The brim of his cap hid part of his face, but what I could see of his expression was serious. Too serious for someone just patrolling a neighborhood full of kids having fun. "There's a curfew," he said, his voice firm but calm. "You need to head home." I was confused. I hadn't heard anything about a curfew. I figured maybe it was something new for Halloween, but none of my friends mentioned it either, and I had seen plenty of other kids out just minutes before. "Curfew?" I asked. "I didn't hear about that." The man took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "It's been in force since earlier tonight. No one's supposed to be out after 10 p.m. Now I don't usually question authority, but something about the way he said it made me uneasy. There was no urgency in his voice, just this weird, cold insistence. He didn't look at me like a cop who was concerned for my safety. He looked at me like I was breaking some unspoken rule. "I'm heading back now," I said, trying to play it cool. "I'm meeting my friends at the park." The man didn't budge. "I'll walk you. Make sure you get home safely." That's when the alarm bells started ringing in my head. It wasn't that far to the park, and I didn't need anyone to walk me there. Plus, why would a cop bother with something like that when there were still plenty of kids out and about? None of it added up. "No, it's fine," I said, taking a step back. "I'm good. My mom's picking me up at the park in a few minutes." I wasn't planning on calling my mom. I was 17 and more than capable of walking around the neighborhood on my own. But something about this guy just didn't feel right, and I wanted him to know I wasn't alone. Maybe that would make him back off. He paused for a moment, looking me over like he was deciding whether or not to believe me. His eyes were cold, calculating, like he was sizing me up. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he finally said. "It's dangerous." His words sent a shiver through me, but not the kind you get from a good scare. It was more like a warning, like he was telling me I was in danger, but not from anything else out there. From him. "Yeah, well, I'll be fine," I muttered, already reaching into my pocket for my phone. "Thanks, though." I could feel his eyes on me as I pulled out my phone and pretended to dial my mom's number. I pressed the phone to my ear, my heart starting to beat a little faster as I tried to stay calm. "Hey, Mom?" "Yeah, I'm at the park. Can you come get me?" I kept talking, hoping the guy would get the hint, but instead, he took another step toward me. "You know, I can take you home," he said, his voice lowering. "It's not safe out here, and you don't want to get in trouble for breaking curfew. I started backing up, my phone still pressed to my ear, but my fake conversation wasn't fooling him. His expression shifted slightly, just enough for me to see the tension behind his eyes. He wasn't trying to help. He was trying to corner me. That's when I made my move. "I'm just going to wait for my mom at the park," I said quickly, turning on my heel and heading down the sidewalk. I didn't bother looking back to see if he was following. All I knew was that I needed to get to the park, somewhere public, where there would be people around. As I walked, I kept looking at my phone, pretending to be deep in conversation, but I couldn't help sneaking a few glances behind me. The man was still there, just far enough back to be out of earshot, but close enough that I could feel his presence like a shadow creeping along behind me. I picked up the pace, my mind racing with a dozen different thoughts. Was this guy really a cop? Or was he just some creep pretending to be one? Either way, I knew one thing. I couldn't let him follow me all the way to the park. That's when I saw it. Chris's mom's car parked up ahead. She was dropping off Chris and Ethan after the haunted house. I jogged toward the car, waving them down. "Hey!" I called out, trying to sound casual, but probably looking a little more frantic than I intended. Chris and Ethan got out of the car, laughing and talking about how great the haunted house was. When they saw me, though, their smiles faded. "Dude, what's up?" Chris asked. "Some guy's been following me," I whispered, looking over my shoulder. "He says he's a cop, but I don't think he's legit." Chris's mom must have noticed the look on my face because she rolled down the window. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "But there's this guy. He says there's a curfew and I should go home, but something's not right." She didn't hesitate. "Get in the car." I didn't argue. I climbed into the back seat, and Chris and Ethan slid in next to me. As soon as the door shut, Chris's mom drove off, leaving the man standing alone at the end of the block. I watched him through the rearview mirror, hoping that would be the last I'd ever see of him. But the story didn't end there. When we got back to my house, I told my mom what had happened. She was furious, especially when she realized this guy had been following me for blocks. She called the police to report it, and that's when things got even weirder. The local precinct said they didn't have any officers patrolling that area. No one had been assigned to enforce a curfew because there wasn't one. Whoever that man was, he wasn't a cop. He was pretending, and I had no idea what he had planned. For days after that, I couldn't shake the memory of his eyes, the way they seemed so empty, yet so focused on me. I kept wondering what would have happened if I hadn't pretended to call my mom, if I hadn't run into Chris and Ethan, if I had let that man take me home. I still walk around my neighborhood sometimes, but I'm a lot more careful now. Halloween's coming up again, and I can't help but think about that night. There are some monsters you expect to see on Halloween. Ghouls, vampires, ghosts. But sometimes the scariest ones are the people who wear normal faces, pretending to be something they're not. Because whoever that man was, he's still out there. And he's probably still wearing that uniform, looking for someone else to fool. This year, I'm definitely not heading out there alone. I was pretty excited when my parents told me they'd be going to a Halloween party this year. Not because I wanted them gone, but because it meant I'd have the house to myself for the night. Being 16, I figured I could handle it. Plus, I had the chance to binge on horror movies, give out candy to the trick-or-treaters, and not have anyone nagging me about how late I was staying up. The night started out just like any other Halloween. I ordered a pizza, set up my stack of horror movies, and kept the bowl of candy by the front door for the kids. There was something eerie about that October night. The cold, the light drizzle of rain tapping against the windows. It all gave the night a sense of suspense, like something just waiting to happen. Around 7 p.m., the first wave of trick-or-treaters arrived. Little kids dressed as superheroes, witches, and monsters. I handed out candy, commented on how awesome their costumes were, and went back to my movie. Every now and then, I'd hear the doorbell ring again, and I'd pause whatever I was watching to hand out more candy. This routine kept going for about an hour. Then around 8:30 the doorbell rang, and when I opened the door, there was only one trick-or-treater. He or she, I couldn't tell. Looked like they were a little too old for this. They had on a cheap, dirty mask. It looked like a knockoff Michael Myers mask, but not quite. It was off-putting in a way that's hard to explain. "Hey, happy Halloween," I said, trying to keep it casual. The figure didn't say anything. They weren't holding out a candy bag or anything, just standing there, staring at me through that mask. After a few awkward seconds, I grabbed a handful of candy and dropped it into their hand. "You go, dude. Have a good night," I said, trying to move the encounter along. The figure tilted its head slightly like they were confused or, I don't know, disappointed. Either way, they finally turned around and walked down the steps, disappearing into the shadows down the street. Weird, but whatever. People can be strange on Halloween. I closed the door and locked it. I remember thinking about how weird the encounter had been, but I shrugged it off and went back to my movie. About half an hour later, I heard something that wasn't the TV or the rain. It was subtle at first, like a soft thump coming from somewhere upstairs. I muted the movie and listened. Silence. Maybe it was just the house settling. I brushed it off, but a few minutes later, I heard it again, only this time, it was louder. It wasn't just one thump, it was a series of creaks, like someone was walking. My first thought was that I'd left the back door unlocked. I had stepped out earlier to bring in some decorations from the backyard and might have forgotten to lock it. No big deal, I told myself. It's just the wind pushing the door or something. But still, something gnawed at me, a sense of unease creeping in. I stood up and walked to the kitchen, which led to the back door. The lights in the kitchen were off, and as I approached, I could see that the back door was slightly ajar. My stomach sank. I always locked the door, at least I thought I did. I went to close it, but then I heard something, a faint sound, like rustling, coming from the stairs. There was no mistaking it now. Someone was in the house. My mind raced through the possibilities. Could it be my parents coming back early? Maybe a neighbor stopping by? But that didn't make sense. No one would come in through the back door without calling first. I stepped back from the kitchen and looked toward the stairs. That's when I saw him. The same figure, the one in the mask, was halfway up the staircase, standing still, like he was waiting for me to notice him. My heart jumped into my throat. This wasn't a harmless trick-or-treater anymore. This was someone who had let themselves into my house. And for what? I locked eyes with the mask. He didn't move. He just stood there, one foot on the stair, one foot off, like he'd been caught in the act of sneaking around. I felt my pulse quicken as I tried to figure out what to do. My phone was upstairs, in my room, and there was no way I was getting past him without a confrontation. I took a step back, and he took a step forward. "Hey!" I shouted, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "What the hell are you doing?" No answer, just another step closer. I bolted for the stairs, my feet slamming against the wood as I raced up them two at a time. I didn't look back. My heart was pounding. But I made it to my room, slammed the door shut, and locked it. I pressed my back against the door, trying to catch my breath. For a moment, everything was silent again. I couldn't hear anything. No footsteps, no breathing, nothing. I grabbed my phone off the desk and dialed my mom. "Mom," I whispered frantically. "There's someone in the house." "What? What do you mean?" "I gave candy to this guy earlier, and now he's inside." "Call the police," she urged. "Lock yourself in your room and stay there. We're coming home right now." I hung up and immediately dialed 911. As I explained the situation to the dispatcher, I heard footsteps again, but this time they were slower, cautious. The masked figure was walking down the hallway outside my door. The dispatcher stayed on the line with me, but my attention was glued to the faint sound of footsteps creeping closer. Every creak of the floorboards felt like it was right outside the door. Then the footsteps stopped. I held my breath, waiting for the worst. Was he standing right outside my door? Was he going to try to break in? I crouched down, trying to stay as quiet as possible, but my heart was pounding so loudly that it felt like he could probably hear it. Minutes passed. Then minutes. I stayed frozen in place, gripping my phone like it was a lifeline. Eventually, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. Thank God. The dispatcher told me to stay put until the police arrived and cleared the house. The next few minutes were the longest of my life. I didn't hear the footsteps anymore, and I didn't know where the masked figure had gone. For all I knew, he could have been hiding in one of the rooms, waiting for the cops to leave. Finally, I heard the police knocking on the front door. I rushed downstairs to let them in. The officers searched the house, but the intruder was gone. They found the back door wide open, just like I had left it, and a few scuff marks near the stairs, as if someone had been there, but no sign of the guy in the mask. They told me I did the right thing by locking myself in the room and calling for help, but still, it felt like an empty victory. The guy had been in my house. He had gotten so close, and I didn't even know what he wanted. The police stayed for a while, and my parents came home not long after, frantic but relieved that I was okay. They asked me a million questions, but I didn't have any answers. I couldn't explain why the guy had come back, or why he'd chosen our house in the first place. Even though the police said they'd patrol the neighborhood for the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the guy might come back. I locked every window, every door, and double-checked them before going to bed that night. And even though Halloween is supposed to be a night for fun and scares, this year, the scare was a little too real for my liking. Who knows what the guy wanted, and why he came back. I wasn't even supposed to go to the Halloween party that night. I had told my friends a dozen times I wasn't in the mood, but they were relentless, and eventually, they wore me down. So, with a little over an hour before the party started, I dug through my closet and threw on the only thing that could remotely pass as a costume, a black hoodie, some face paint to look like a skeleton, and an old pair of gloves I cut the fingers out of. Not my best work, but it'd do. It was a house party at Lucas's place, out by the edge of town. His family owned a huge, sprawling estate with more rooms than anyone needed, and their Halloween parties were the stuff of legend. I'd been to a few over the years, and they always got out of control. My best friend Danny picked me up around 8, and we headed over. The streets were already filled with kids trick-or-treating, and I found myself watching them through the car window. Their costumes, their laughter, it all felt innocent, like Halloween should be. Meanwhile, here I was, heading to a party where I knew people would be getting too drunk to care about anything remotely fun. Lucas's house was lit up with those fake spiderwebs all over the front yard, skeletons hanging from the trees, and jack-o'-lanterns glowing on every step leading up to the front door. The sound of loud music hit us as soon as we stepped out of the car, and I could already see a few people stumbling around, red Solo cups in hand. "Looks like the party's in full swing," Danny said, grinning. I just nodded, not really feeling it, but trying not to be a buzzkill. We made our way inside, and it was crowds of people in half-assed costumes, loud music, and a few people already passed out on the couches. The air smelled like cheap beer and sweat, and the bass from the speakers was so heavy it felt like it was shaking the walls. We wandered around for a bit, catching up with some people we knew. I wasn't drinking much, just nursing a beer and trying to find some kind of energy to enjoy myself. But something was bugging me. It was this nagging feeling, like someone was watching me. Not in the casual, there are a lot of people at this party kind of way, but more like a specific targeted stare. At first I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just the overwhelming energy of the party, or maybe I was just being paranoid. But every time I moved through the house, every time I looked over my shoulder, I saw someone in the crowd, a tall figure, wearing an old-fashioned suit and a full-face mask, one of those vintage, creepy-looking ones you see in black and white horror movies. It looked like a mix between a clown and a mime, with a frozen grin and hollow eyes. At first I thought it was just someone in costume, having a good time, trying to freak people out. But no matter where I went, I saw him. At the end of the hallway, in the kitchen, out by the pool, always standing there, never interacting with anyone, just watching. "Hey, you good?" Danny asked me when he noticed I'd gone quiet. "Yeah, I guess," I muttered, still trying to keep my eyes on the crowd, wondering where that guy was now. Danny raised an eyebrow. "You don't look like you're having a great time. Want to head out?" I shook my head. "Nah, I'm fine. Just thought I saw something weird, that's all." "Weird? It's Halloween, man. You're supposed to see weird stuff," Danny joked, giving me a light punch on the arm. I smiled, trying to act like I was overreacting, but something still felt wrong. As the night dragged on, I tried to lose myself in the noise, the people, anything to distract me from that unsettling feeling. But it didn't work. Every time I caught a glimpse of that masked figure, it sent a jolt through me. I'd turn away for a second, and when I looked back, he'd be gone. It wasn't until later in the night, when things started to wind down, that things took a turn. Danny had gone off somewhere, probably with some girl, and I found myself sitting on the back porch, trying to get some air. It was quieter out there, just the muffled sound of music coming from inside the house, and the cool night air was a relief from the heat of the party. That's when I saw him again. The figure in the mask, standing by the trees at the edge of the property, just barely visible in the shadows. I stood up, my heart racing a little now. I couldn't explain it, but there was something about him that didn't feel right. Like he wasn't just some guy in a costume. I walked back inside, scanning the room for Danny, or anyone I knew. But the house had started to empty out. People were leaving. The music was quieter, and I realized it was way later than I thought. I decided I'd had enough. I wasn't going to stick around any longer. I pulled out my phone to text Danny, telling him I was heading out, but I couldn't get a signal. Typical. As I made my way through the house, I saw fewer and fewer people. It was like the party had evaporated, leaving behind a handful of stragglers. I headed down a side hallway, looking for the bathroom before I left. The hall was dimly lit, the music barely audible now, and I realized just how quiet it had gotten. I reached the end of the hall and pushed open the bathroom door, only to find it empty. As I stepped inside, I caught something in the mirror. My reflection, and just behind me, standing in the hallway, was the man in the mask. I spun around, but the hall was empty. My stomach tightened, and I felt a wave of unease wash over me. This wasn't funny anymore. Whoever this guy was, he was taking the whole creepy act way too far. I rushed back down the hall, ready to grab Danny and get the hell out of there, but as I turned the corner, I stopped in my tracks. There, in the middle of the room, was the masked man. He wasn't moving, wasn't saying anything, just standing there, blocking my way out. I could hear the faint sound of the music from the other room, but everything else was silent. No one else was around. I froze for a second, my mind racing, trying to figure out what to do. This had to be a joke, some kind of Halloween prank. But the way he stood there, the way his head tilted slightly, as if he were studying me, it didn't feel like a prank. "Hey man, you win, okay? You got me. I'm freaked out. Can you just move?" The masked man didn't respond. He didn't even flinch, just stood there, blocking my path. I took a step back, and that's when he moved. Slowly, he took a step forward, then another. His movements were unnaturally smooth, like he was gliding toward me. "Okay, seriously, dude. This isn't funny," I said, my voice shaking now. I backed up farther. The man kept coming, one slow step after another, closing the distance between us. I turned and bolted down the hall and raced back toward the main room. I kept running until I burst through the back door, stumbling onto the porch. I looked around, but no one was there. The yard was empty, the house eerily quiet. For a second I thought I might be losing it. Maybe I'd had too much to drink, or maybe the party had gotten to me. But then I heard the door behind me creak open, and I knew I wasn't imagining it. The masked man was following me. I didn't think. I just ran. Across the yard, through the trees, my legs pumping as fast as they could. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps unnervingly steady, like he wasn't even trying to run, just keeping pace. I darted through the trees, branches scraping against my skin. I had no idea where I was going, just away from him. I burst out onto the road, my chest heaving, and looked over my shoulder. The masked man had stopped at the edge of the trees. He didn't follow me onto the road. He just stood there, his head tilted to the side. I kept running until I reached the end of the road, where Danny was leaning against his car, talking to some girl I didn't recognize. I skidded to a stop, grabbing the side of the car for balance. Danny looked up, confused, his conversation cut short by the sight of me practically collapsing next to him. "Dude, what the hell?" he asked. "There's someone up there." I managed to choke out, pointing back up the road toward the house. A guy, in a mask. He was just watching me. He didn't say anything, just stood there, staring. Danny pushed off the car and took a step closer. "You serious?" Danny asked, his tone shifting from casual to concerned. Dead serious. He was just standing there in the dark. I don't know what his deal is, but it's not good. Danny looked up the road. "All right, let's go check it out," he said, grabbing a flashlight from the back seat. "What? You're not seriously going back up there?" the girl protested, clearly unnerved by what I just said. Danny shot her a reassuring grin. "We'll be fine. Probably just some idiot messing around. We'll scare him off." I hesitated, my pulse still racing, but the idea of confronting the guy with Danny at my side made me feel a little braver. "All right, but if things get weird, we're getting out of there." Danny agreed, and we started back up the road. The street was eerily quiet now. I felt a mixture of fear and adrenaline pushing me forward. As we approached Lucas's house, I scanned the yard, expecting to see the masked man lurking behind one of the trees or peeking out from the bushes, but there was nothing, just an empty yard. "He was right here," I whispered, pointing to the spot where I'd last seen him. Danny swept the flashlight across the area, illuminating the porch, the trees, even the side of the house. But the man was gone. "Are you sure you weren't just imagining things?" Danny asked, his tone light, but there was a hint of doubt creeping in. "I know what I saw," I insisted, frustration bubbling up inside me. "He was right here, standing still. I'm not making this up." Danny nodded. "All right, man, I believe you, but whoever it was, they're gone now. Maybe it was just some dude trying to mess with people." I didn't respond, my eyes still scanning the shadows, looking for any sign of movement, but the street was silent, empty. "Come on, let's get out of here," Danny said, clapping me on the shoulder. "Whoever he was, he's long gone now." Back at the car, the girl was waiting, looking uneasy. "So, what happened?" she asked as we approached. Danny shook his head. "Nothing. Whoever it was, they're gone now." She didn't look convinced, and honestly, neither was I. I slid into the passenger seat, my hands still trembling slightly as Danny started the car. We drove away, the tension easing now. But even as we turned onto the main road, I couldn't stop looking out the window, expecting to see that masked figure standing at the edge of the woods, watching us leave. I don't know who that guy was or what he wanted, but every Halloween, when the parties start again, I wonder if he'll show up for someone else. There's something about Halloween night that makes you do things you wouldn't normally do. Maybe it's the excitement in the air, the feeling that anything could happen, or just the adrenaline that comes with the whole spooky vibe. Whatever it is, that night still haunts me, and not for the reasons you'd expect. It was supposed to be a fun adventure, just me and a few of my friends spending the night in an old, abandoned church. We'd heard all the rumors about the place. Some people said it was haunted. Others said it was a cache for squatters, or maybe even something darker. But none of that bothered us. We were teenagers, and when you're a teenager, you think you're invincible, or at least you think nothing bad will ever actually happen to you. The church sat on the edge of town, tucked between a cornfield and a patch of woods that always seemed too quiet. The surrounding area had an eerie stillness, almost like it was stuck in time. By day, the cornfield stretched endlessly, but by night, everything felt different. The darkness seemed to swallow everything, and the woods and cornfield both took on a menacing quality. The church, with its crumbling walls and shattered windows, stood like a forgotten monument to something long dead. It had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember, and the windows were shattered. The roof partially caved in, but the walls were still intact, standing like a skeleton of what it once was. The stories about the place varied. Some said it was cursed. Others whispered about strange rituals that had taken place inside long after the church had been deserted. The allure was too strong for a group of bored teenagers like us. I was with my usual crew, Jacob, Lisa, and Aaron. We'd all known each other since middle school, and we were always looking for the next thrill. Jacob had suggested the church after hearing some local kids talking about it at school. Lisa wasn't too thrilled about the idea. She'd always been a bit more cautious, but she didn't want to be left out. Aaron, on the other hand, was all in. He was the kind of guy who thrived on adrenaline and loved proving how fearless he was. So that's how we found ourselves driving out to the old church on Halloween night. We brought sleeping bags, flashlights, and enough snacks to last us through the night. The plan was simple. We'd tell ghost stories, maybe explore the building a little, and see if we could catch a glimpse of anything paranormal. When we pulled up, the place looked even more run down than I'd remembered. The overgrown grass and weeds surrounded the structure like a natural barrier, making it seem even more isolated. The front doors were hanging off their hinges, and vines had crawled up the sides, making it look like nature was trying to swallow the whole building. The air was cold and still, and the only sound was our own footsteps as we made our way inside. The full moon cast its pale light over everything, and I couldn't help but feel like we were being watched. I ignored it, telling myself it was probably just my nerves. After all, this was what we wanted, right? A scare, a thrill, something to break up the monotony of life in a small town. Jacob was the first to push open the doors, and they creaked loudly as they swung inward. The inside of the church was just as you'd expect, dusty, dark, and eerie. Pews were scattered around, some overturned, others rotting where they stood. The altar at the front was cracked and broken, but there was enough moonlight filtering through the broken windows to give the room an unsettling glow. "Perfect," Aaron said, grinning as he dropped his backpack onto one of the pews. "This place is awesome." Lisa wasn't as enthusiastic. "I don't know, guys. This feels off." "Oh, come on," Jacob said, rolling his eyes. "It's just a building. Nothing's going to happen." I didn't say anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Lisa might be right. There was something about the place that felt wrong, like we weren't supposed to be there. But I shrugged it off and followed the others as they set up their sleeping bags in the middle of the main room. We sat around in a circle, using our flashlights to create little pockets of light as we shared stories and laughed about how ridiculous some of the rumors were. Aaron, of course, was in full storyteller mode, trying to freak us out with exaggerated tales of ghosts and demons. We laughed it off, but the truth was, the atmosphere was starting to get to us. The cold, the darkness, the way every sound echoed through the empty building, it was all getting under our skin. It was when we decided to take a break from the storytelling that the mood shifted even more. About an hour in, we heard it. Footsteps. They were faint at first, so faint that I thought maybe I'd imagined them. But then they got louder, closer, echoing through the halls of the church like someone was walking just out of sight. Lisa's eyes went wide, and she clutched her flashlight tighter. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Aaron smirked. "Probably just an animal. This place is old. There's got to be rats or something running around." But these weren't the quick, scurrying sounds of rats. They were heavy footsteps, the kind made by something human. Jacob stood up, his flashlight beam sweeping across the room. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing in the vast, empty space. "Anyone there?" No response. We all exchanged uneasy glances, but no one wanted to admit that they were scared. After all, we were just here for fun, right? There was nothing to be afraid of. But then the footsteps started again, this time louder and more distinct, like they were coming from the hallway that led to the back of the church. "I'm going to check it out," Aaron said, standing up and grabbing his flashlight. "No way," Lisa said. "Let's just stay here. It's probably nothing." "Yeah, probably," Aaron said with a grin. "But what if it's not?" Before any of us could stop him, Aaron started walking toward the hallway. Jacob and I followed, more out of solidarity than anything else, and Lisa reluctantly trailed behind us. The hallway was narrow and dark, with doors on either side that led to smaller rooms. The footsteps had stopped, but the silence was even worse. Every gust of wind through the broken windows seemed magnified in the stillness. We reached the end of the hallway, where a single door stood slightly ajar. Aaron pushed it open, and we stepped inside, what looked like an old storage room. It was small, with shelves lining the walls, and a few broken chairs scattered around. But the thing that stood out the most was the door at the far end of the room, the one that led down to the basement. Jacob pointed his flashlight at it, and we all just stared at it for a moment. "You're not seriously thinking about going down there, are you?" I asked. "Why not? We came here to explore, didn't we?" Aaron said. I looked at Lisa, who looked like she was about to bolt, but she didn't say anything. I didn't want to be the one to back out, so I reluctantly followed as Aaron pushed open the basement door. The stairs creaked under our weight as we made our way down, and the smell of damp earth filled the air. It was colder down there, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, and as we reached the bottom, we saw it. A figure. Standing in the corner of the basement, for a moment, none of us moved. None of us spoke. We just stared at the figure, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. It was tall, with broad shoulders, and it was standing completely still, facing the wall. "Who's there?" Aaron called out, his voice louder than it needed to be. The figure didn't move. It didn't even flinch. My heart was racing now, and I could feel the tension in the air as we waited for anything to happen. But the figure just stood there, silent and unmoving. "We should go," I said quietly. Aaron didn't argue this time. He took a step back, and we all slowly backed up toward the stairs, never taking our eyes off the figure. But just as we reached the bottom step, the figure turned. It didn't turn around all the way, just enough for us to see its face. Or rather, the lack of one. Its face was featureless, smooth and pale, like it had been erased. That was enough for us. We bolted up the stairs, our footsteps echoing through the empty church as we ran back toward the main room. I could hear Lisa breathing heavily behind me, and Aaron's flashlight beam was bouncing wildly as he sprinted ahead. We didn't stop until we were outside, gasping for breath in the cold night air. "What the hell was that?" Jacob panted, doubling over with his hands on his knees. "I don't know," I admitted, "but we're not going back in there." None of us argued with that. We grabbed our stuff and got the hell out of there, not stopping until we were back in the car. As we drove away, I looked back at the church. The windows were dark, and the building looked as lifeless as ever. But I felt like something was still watching us, from the shadows. We didn't talk much on the ride home. There wasn't much to say. We'd gone looking for a thrill, for a scare, and we'd found something far worse, something we couldn't explain. And to this day, I still don't know what we saw in that basement. But I do know one thing. I'm never going back to that church. If these Halloween tales gave you goosebumps, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more chilling stories. Got a scary trick-or-treat experience of your own? Drop it in the comments below. We'd love to hear it. And remember, this Halloween, keep your eyes open. You never know what's lurking behind that mask. Stay safe out there. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.